In this current scene, I just have a very simple environment with using the floor object. Just kind of make a little bit of dirt out to a sky object with a very simple gradient material on it. And in the scene, what we're going to be doing is taking this tree object and creating basically a leaf generator for it. The tree itself was created in a plugin for Lightwave called Tree Designer, which creates some really nice looking trees. Chances are if you're using Cinema, you probably don't have access to Lightwave, but if you do, you should check out Tree Designer. Really amazing plugin. With the object, and this setup is basically automatically done from the export from Lightwave. It gives us some UV maps for the bark, and it breaks down selection tags to having basically one for the roots, and then one for the main trunk area that goes up, one for the branches, and also one for the twig sections, which is what I'm going to be using to control MoGraph. If you do not have access to Tree Designer or a pre-set up tree like this, and you have to model your own, a really easy way to get the selection for the tips is to start with the tree, go to the polygon mode, and this is a HyperNerbs object, so the original is much smaller in geometry. What I'm going to do is go to the rectangular selection, and we're going to switch over to one of the side views. And for the rectangular selection, I'm going to turn off only visible elements, and that way we're selecting everything. So I'm going to start with the trunk and just kind of move my way up it. And under selection, I'm going to invert. And what I can start to do is basically shrink the selection. So the keyboard shortcut is UK, and you can just keep doing that. If you're having trouble with it just going perfectly linear, then you may need to start out with something a little bit smaller. But as you can see, we start to get more of just the branch ends selected. So if you need to modify that selection to begin with, maybe reduce some of the areas. Either way, this is a pretty decent way to just kind of slim down the selection to more of the root areas. It's just depending on kind of where you stop. One thing we could do is select more of the inner area, and then go to selection, invert, and do the same thing where we're going to reduce the selection. And if you need to, you can set that up in the different viewports, kind of going over the original selection so that you can get the sides like this looks. So basically, that would be going back, selecting the center, and then going over to the front view in this case, and holding down Control and deselecting the sides. So that way, now we can invert and then reduce the selection. So this is a good way to set up your tags for any sort of tree. And that way we're confined to more of the outer branches. We can leave a little open on the inside. And then all you need to do is go to Selection and set the selection to create the selection tag, which you can then link to MoGraph. Tree Designer also exports some weight maps for the object. These become really helpful for different types of animation, but we're not really going to be focusing on those or using those at the moment. So what we want to do is first take a look at the object we're going to be using as the leaf. It's a very simple object. Just 9 polygons, and on it I have a texture map that is a small little grouping or cluster of leaves. I also have sort of a random colorizer setup on this. We'll take a look at that after the object is set up, because there's some really cool things you can do with varying the texture throughout the object and throughout the scene so that it's not exactly the same color. You can have some nice little variations, and a lot of those can be set up directly within the material without any effectors needed. So this object, very simple, not a whole lot to it. Do have the object axis set to where the stem is going to be connecting to the twig-like branches on the tree. And I already have a couple of objects set up for this. Basically, what we're primarily going to, of course, be using is the MoGraph generator, which is the cloner object. So from MoGraph, you can select the cloner object to add this object in, which I've named Leaf Cluster Generator. Let's go ahead to the attributes and take a look. What we want to do is set this to our tree object, which can be either the sub D or the actual polygons. It's probably better just to use the polygons because the selection tags are applied to that. So what we can do is take the tree and drag this into the object. Our selection is going to be that polygon selection, whether you made it custom or, in this case, I'm using Tree Designer, which is the twig selection. Now, the count amount is going to be a little off. Whenever you're using any sort of surface mode with polygon selection, the amount I ended up with was around 12,000 in order to fill this, but there are not 12,000 really within the scene. So let's take a look at some of the other settings. Of course, turning on render instances because we don't want to have all of these objects duplicated. I have my up vector set to Y on the positive because of the orientation of the object itself and the leaves. And the clone is also aligned. That's going to make it a little bit easier and take less effectors in order to distribute our leaves. So once that's set up, I also want to add in a display tag, which I've already done. So you can right-click, go to C4D tags, add display, and what I can do is choose to enable the textures on basically everything, the entire tree. A little later, which would be higher up in the chain, but right now it would be all of the leaves. Another good idea is to set up your material to be previewed in massive amounts. My level of detail at 100 I'm going to stick with for the moment. But one thing I do want to do is select the material, the leaf cluster, and go to Editor and change the texture preview size to as small as you can put it, which in my case is 64 by 64. And we can see in this case it hasn't really updated the color or any of the other channels. You can also choose whether or not you even want to display the additional channels, diffusion, and so on. Because the color has not updated, I'm hoping that once I move the object into the cloner that it should fix the texture, but just to be on the safe side, I'm going to grab that display tag for viewing the leaves and turn off textures. So now we have the object selection set up within the cloner. Object set to tree 6, which is the main tree, with the twigs selection and the branches. And I'm going to go ahead and take the count and just turn it down to 200 to start with, and then take that leaf cluster and drag that into the generator. So we're only seeing a very minimal amount. And go to this display tag and turn textures back on and see how well that is showing up. It's probably because I'm using the projector in order to control the color variation. which we'll take a look at in just a sec, but that does look like it is possibly causing a problem with the OpenGL display. So if I have to, I may need to disable the color or anything using the projector just to keep a very low memory scene. So now we can go over to the generator and increase the amount of leaves we have. Since I do have my display set to 100% level of detail, so it is showing everything. But it's not nearly enough. Like I said before, I had it around 12,000. So let's go ahead and bump it up to 12,000. And you can see that really fill up quite well. And go ahead and we can take a look at a render. I do have my shadows, I think, a little dark compared to the rest of the leaves. It is set to ray trace at the moment. So I'll probably end up just changing that overall shadow density, bringing it down from 100, maybe increasing the main light intensity, because it's a little dark. But overall it looks pretty good. You can see a good distribution of leaves. I do want to modify that sunlight, which is just an infinite light. I've just renamed it. And let's go ahead and take our shadows and bring them down to about 70. And I'm going to go ahead and just adjust the camera, which I currently do not have a camera in the scene, so I'm going to go ahead and add one. Select the object, and we can rotate around it to see the lighting a little bit better. Okay, so it doesn't look too bad. Pretty good distribution. I do want to modify and create some randomness for the sizing, because at the moment all the leaves are the same size. So we do want to create a little variation on that. I do want to note that I have under the transform the scale of the object set to 0.2 on the X, Y, and Z, because the original scale output was far too large compared to the tree. And I just have a little bit of heading, pitch, and bank just to kind of align them with the branches. That's really going to depend on the object. In this case, it worked pretty well for the leaves. And there's currently no effectors added in. Now, I have created one, which is the step effector. This is going to give us a nice distribution of scaling with scaling checked on. So we're going to drag that effector into the effectors of the clone, or the generator. If you don't have any effectors in the scene, you can go ahead and from the MoGraph menu, mine's slightly modified, you can select the step effector. So the settings for the step effector, I have the transform mode set to absolute, which is going to give us an exact scale, and uniform scale is turned on, so it is going to size equally on all the axes. And I have the scale set to 0.3, which what is happening is it's reducing the scale in a range from 1 to 0.3. So if I change that to 1, we're going to have, since it is in the absolute mode, hardly any change. Do 0.5, 0.3, which is where I had it. You can bring it down to 0.2, even smaller, so you have some very small leaves showing in certain areas. And we can change the transformation space, which will affect rotation typically a little bit more than the scale. And then we do have a step gap and a spline option under Effector. The step gap, what we can do is change the variation based on a step amount, which that step amount is set within the effector itself, depending on what it is we're deforming under the parameters. So we could also set up a spline. And with the absolute mode, it looks like it's not really allowing us to step through it very well. And that's probably just because of the overall settings. Switch that to node for the transformation. Modify clone. At this point, it's not going to do anything because we only have one object, which is the leaf cluster. So let's go back to the step effector and let's do 0.3. And then I'm going to reset that spline, step gap 0, and that should work out pretty well. We can set up the minimum and maximum values if you want to scale or adjust beyond the settings that you have. Change that back to absolute. We're going to get a much larger output. You can see if we bring the minimum up to 100%, we have all of the leaves being that new scale. We bring it down to negative 100, and almost everything resizes upward. So we're going to set that minimum to 0, and that's going to give us a pretty nice variation overall. So let's go ahead and render that out. Now, at the moment, the color variation I set up is basically null. At least it is for distribution. It's going to, at the moment, appear exactly the same on every single leaf. The reason for that is because the texture for the leaf cluster is applied to the object that's being cloned rather than the cloner. So what we can actually do is take the texture from the leaf, and instead of applying this to the leaf itself, we're going to drag it onto or into the tags for the generator. So now the generator has its own texture on it. We can take a look at the object view, the traditional object view, and we can see that is added to the object, and there is no texture whatsoever on the leaf. This will allow us to set up a different scaling system or a different coordinate system for the texture, making it relative to the size of the clones rather than just the individual object that's being cloned. So we also need to set up a different kind of texture in order to lock some of the primary values, being the color and the alpha and all of the main maps to the UV, but open up the variation to effect within more of a world scale. Because otherwise, we're still going to end up with that repeating look on every single leaf. So in order to do that, what we need to do is select the material, and we're going to set up that color variation, which I have. I'm going to go ahead and just start this from scratch. So I'm going to copy my color and just paste it. So now we have no color variation whatsoever. So what I want to do is change the cluster over to Fusion. So from texture map to Fusion, but since the texture is already loaded, that is going to be our base channel. Our blend channel is going to be our global channel. And what we need to do is set that up in a different coordinate space than the tag, because otherwise it's just going to map it just to the leaves and the UV. So we're going to go to the blend channel and turn on noise. So a noise is going to be blending with it. And we're going to go ahead and change the color, color 1 to a different color green, and we can set it up to more of a yellow for color 2. I'm going to go ahead and increase the contrast, and our space we're going to set to world, which still isn't going to make a difference because of the way the tag is applied. So after this is set up the way we want it, we're going to need to make a few changes. I'm going to set my global scale, actually I'll go ahead and set that maybe to 150 for now, and we'll go back, and that blend channel needs to be changed. Under effects, we're going to select projector. So now we're going to project this noise in a different coordinate space. So instead of using the UV coordinate, we can specify the projection as being spherical. So that's going to give us something that looks a little bit better. What I also want to do is, under noise, use as an environment, and then project the environment. That way we're encompassing more of the material change throughout the entire object, and more relative to the space of the object. So let's take a look without any blends, and just basically the noise as the color. Unless I did set up the blend channel. I don't believe I did. So now if we take a look at the render, what we can see are the different colors showing throughout the generation of the leaves. Right now the color channel is no longer really showing the texture, it's just showing just that noise. So that's also an acceptable way, since we have diffusion, and the luminance channels, and the bump, and everything else linked to the texture. So we could leave it like this and just set up some new colors to make it look a little more realistic. But what I want to do is go to Fusion, and we can set up a different kind of blend for this noise channel, and then also the original color map. So if the burn mode's too dark, we can set up just color, which is going to give us a direct overlay of the color. We can set it to overlay, which sometimes is a little too intense. Screen will brighten it up. Soft light works pretty well for this setup. But otherwise, burn will give you a darker variation, which I sometimes like the way that looks. Saturation can work quite well in some situations, depending on the original colors you have set. So I mean, it's really up to you and how you like to work with your blends. I'm going to go ahead and set mine to the soft light. And now I may need to modify the scale a little bit. So we have length and the X and Y. I do want to go to the noise and take the relative scale and just make a few modifications. You can also set up a more complex noise if you want to. We could also set this to an object space, which I'm going to go ahead and do, just so if we move it to another scene, we don't need to worry about the noise not matching correctly to the scale of the object. So the object space, in this case, is going to end up working a lot better. So now we can see the blend with the color texture map also included. And I might go ahead and turn down the blend amount. And if you're using maybe two different color maps that you have available, maybe different time frame of the year, or you just want to have a different color variation, but it's still going to use the same alpha, just basically a color variation texture, then what you can do is take that as the blend channel. So basically in this case I would just copy and paste if I was to use the same texture, and then load in a different one, and then use the projected noise, so with the projector and the noise, and instead of using the blend channel, use it on the mask channel. So you turn on mask, and then instead of using the colors for the noise for color 1 and 2, you set that to, leave it at default, which would be black and white, and that way you can just kind of mix between your two texture maps. That would also work if you were to set up an additional alpha to overlay, so if you wanted to have two different textures. Either way, it's a good idea at this point to set up a selection tag, since I don't have one for the leaf cluster, because once we want to start adding other objects, we don't want them to have the exact same texture. We want to be able to limit it, and eventually, of course, we're going to be cloning the entire tree as well. So it's a good idea to create a selection tag, and that's pretty simple. So we're going to select the leaf cluster, go to polygons, And what we can do is just use the rectangular selection. Only select visible elements. Checked off. Select all of our leaves. Go to Selection, Set Selection, and we can now name this Leaves. So now when we go to our texture, that is mapped to the cloner object, we can drag the tag of leaves into that selection. In that way, we can now add additional objects and just make sure that that current material is just applied to the leaves. So once you have this set up in this stage, what you can do is create a null object, which is going to be the main object and kind of the grouping of the effector and also the cloner object. We call this tall tree, and then we can drag everything from the object into that. So now we can clone this null object. Since there's really no point in recreating this every single time you want to add leaves, it's also a good idea to create a preset object, which would be your leaf generator object. What you could even do is set up, instead of having just one type of leaf available, maybe giving yourself quite a few to choose from, and disabling basically the textures, removing them to create a good preset. You may not want to include the tree object, so what you can do is take the tree object out of that null, and then we can save this null object. If I was to delete the texture tag, then save the object preset, so that way you can load in your leaf generator whenever you want. Makes it pretty easy. If you want, you can have the material and leave it, but because that can store a lot in the memory, depending on the depth and the large, or how large the texture is, it's a good idea to create a preview texture that can be used with very, very simple setup, very simple image maps, just to give you an idea of what the leaves look like. So what we can do is create a temporary that's going to show up. And I've just dragged in two images that I've created for this. They are very small images, and what I have is an alpha and a color. The color isn't necessary, but the way I have it set up, we'll see it in just a second, the red at the top of the image will indicate the direction of the leaf or the object it's applied to. So what I want to do is select the alpha, and you can see it's a 5 by 5 pixel image, so very small, and select our other material, assign the alpha. We can just turn off specular because we don't want that to add anything extra to the texture memory. And I'm going to turn off soft, and in this case with this PNG I do need to turn off image alpha in order for it to show up. So now we can adjust the delta and clip out even more of that leaf, and the color is going to be that material, which we can see another 5 by 5 image with a little bit of red up on the top. And that's really just to show me where the leaves are facing and make it a little bit easier. So we'll select our other material and go ahead and go to the material editor, select color, and just paste it in there. You can also, if you want to add a little depth to it, copy the alpha, maybe add it to the bump. That is going to increase the amount of needed texture memory. What you also want to do is invert it. So selecting the texture and reversing the black point and white point. So setting black point to 1, white point to 0, and that way we have more of a bump look to it. So this can be our preview material, that we would save out with our preset object. If we take a look at it right now, I'm going to go ahead and delete the other one from the scene. We can see how those leaves are going to look, and because the texture blending and mip mapping are so good in cinema from using small resolution images, this would even be a somewhat acceptable final texture if I was just to remove that red direction variation. Because as you can see, it's going to blend very well and uses very little texture memory, and it's going to render pretty quick too. So we can go ahead and take a look at a render. And from far away, this would be somewhat acceptable, even just to use the alpha to get a very, very nice smooth edge is also not a bad idea, provided that the rest of the maps match up correctly. But this works as a pretty good preview overall. Although the shape of the polygon it's applied to doesn't really match too much with the texture, but either way, it's a good idea to it's a good way to set up your generator with very minimal texture being used. Also a good idea to go to the editor and make sure that the preview size is set to the lowest possible. We don't want it to be sampled to a higher resolution. And then you can go through the individual channels too if you want to turn off the bump, if you don't think that that's really necessary to view. What we can also do if you want to remove the color is just set up your main color and then get rid of the mix strength. So that way you've just got a very simple material applied, enough to see the leaf shape, but it really takes up a lot less memory.